Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this seminar, this LBMA, LPPM and IPMI seminar. Coming to you virtually today. Unfortunately, we had to cancel both this seminar in person and our annual dinner, which was due to be held tonight at the Natural History Museum, with wonderful entertainment provided by Darragh O'Brien. But unfortunately, COVID got the better of us, and we had to make the decision, unfortunately, to cancel the in-person seminar and cancel our dinner. We are very disappointed, as I know a lot of our members are, but it was the right thing to do. But rather than losing everything, we are going ahead virtually with our seminar. So instead of a funny Irish comedian at the dinner tonight, you have a far less entertaining Irish woman moderating this session. And I want to thank our four speakers today. We have up front Jim Steele, Chief Precious Metals Analyst at HSBC. Then we have Paul Fisher, Chairman of LBMA, but also wearing his academic hat as a Fellow of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We then have Matthew Turner, Chief Market Intelligence Manager at Pgms at Anglo American. And then last but by no means least, Philip Newman, Managing Director at Metals Focus. I would like to really thank our speakers for stepping in and doing all this virtually. I'd like to thank all those who are listening and watching in. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Jim Steele to kick us off. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Edel, and thank you to Ruth and Paul and everybody associated with this. Thank you. It's a pleasure being invited. Well, this is a sort of broad historical sweep looking at who has been historically friendly towards gold and who has been against the market, and what are the reasons, and what can we draw from that? You know, gold has been described as the perennial metal, and it is quoted, by the way, 417 times in the Bible, 10 times in the Quran. Silver is quoted 320 times in the Bible and 124 times in the Quran. And 43 Bible verses are devoted largely to gold. So it's going to be very hard to improve upon these books, but it does show the longevity of this metal. And that's why I'm trying to show. You know, my first girlfriend's mother used to tell her that you're judged by the company you keep. And I think that was a slighted reference towards her poor judgment in dating me. But I compiled a list of historical and economic figures who had stated either had conducted pro-gold policies or made comments that were pro-gold, and those that were against gold in some way, managed the gold market, compulsory purchase, or in some way made negative comments around gold. And the pro camp includes the classical economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, another classical economist, Jevons, along with Alfred Marshall, Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Raegan, the leader of the nationalists in China, Chiang Kai-shek, the founder, the monetarist economist von Mises, Milton Friedman, well known to everybody, the first post-war Chancellor of Germany, Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, and Deng Xiaoping, reformist premier in China. Now, those that were against gold or made anti-gold comments or policies include Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Francisco Franco, dictator of Spain, Franklin Roosevelt, perennial presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, Richard Nixon, Mao Zedong, Henry VIII, Prime Minister Gladstone, economist John Maynard Keynes, and J.K. Galbraith, and Harold Wilson. Now, obviously, the pro side is not entirely without fault, and the anti side is not entirely without fault. But I think it's pretty free to say that if one is judged by the company they keep, one would want to be on the left side of this ledger, on the pro camp, rather than on the anti camp. I think that's very, very clear. Now, what is it that gold does, or what is it about gold that makes political and economic figures praise it or despise it? And where does gold tend to be most popular? Well, countries traditionally, and I'm not speaking about any country in the current climate, I want to make that quite clear, but countries traditionally that have had higher inflation, some history of arbitrary seizure of property, weaker institutions, including the judiciary or central banks, threats to civil liberties, these are all countries where gold tends to be more popular. And what I think the essence to come away with who likes gold and who doesn't like gold, who has put in policies pro-gold and who has put in policies against gold, is that gold is essentially a political and economic critique. It cannot be managed by the government in the way that monetary policy can or fiscal policy can. It cannot even be adjudicated by the courts. So therefore, it is beyond government's control. It is, in fact, a barometer of public opinion on leaders and on policies. And those that have wished to suppress it or contain it or control it have tended to be on one side of the political spectrum or the other. More liberal, more free markets have tended to look at gold for what it is, as a symbol of freedom. Now, not all gold antagonists were despots by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair cannot come into that category. And they certainly cannot be compared with the others, except in their views for being rather against gold. But the other interesting point is that despite the negatives given by Lenin and Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini and Franco, they have still been very keen to use gold when it suited them and for the purposes of sustaining their regimes. And just to show some of the things that may not be as well known about these different camps. Alfred Marshall used gold. It was an essential part of gold's quantity theory of money, and that which is in essence the basis for monetary theory today. Gold played an absolutely instrumental point in that. Movements of gold and silver have had great geopolitical impact. For example, in 1933, in the case of silver, President Roosevelt put in the silver purchasing program, which effectively was a subsidy because of massive American purchase of domestic silver to silver producers. Well, this did long-term damage to silver's position as a bimetal in the world monetary policy, but the one nation that was on the silver standard, the one major nation, was China. This caused severe deflation in China in the 1930s and was a contributor to the Chinese Revolution. So in very odd way, not a major one, but it did play a modest role. With the victory of Mao in 1948, we saw Mao changing to a gold yuan, and then after that, the compulsory purchase, the forced purchase of gold, silver, and foreign exchange into the Chinese central banks, and gold was used to support the regime early in those days. In 1935, on a somewhat amusing point, Mussolini did his very best to encourage Italian women to hand in their gold wedding rings in return for good old-fashioned fascist steel no pun on my name, by the way, wedding rings. I don't believe it met with resounding success from Italian women, and then some harsher and rather stricter methods came after that. Harold Wilson was not beyond anti-movements in the gold market. In 1966, under the strains that the pound was under Bretton Woods, many people figured out that the pound would be devalued one day and were importing significant amounts of gold coins. Well, the government moved against that, and a number of coin dealers were prosecuted. Lenin famously said in his treatise, "The importance of gold now and after the complete victory of socialism." Well, good luck on that one. That they would use gold. He looked forward to one day using gold to pave the lavatories of the Soviet Union. But in the meantime, he said, we can use gold for our own purposes, and those purposes never ceased. The Soviet Union continued to use gold despite disparaging it, despite it being used by both Lenin and Stalin repeatedly. And in fact, as late as 1964, the Soviets were exporting significant amounts of gold into the United States and Canada and other grain-producing countries in order to pay for grain. And ironically, the Soviets went some way to supporting what was then already the Bretton Woods system and the last gold standard, a system which was already beginning to show signs of strains. They effectively subsidized it by allowing the Americans to assume a greater amount of gold than they would have. Stalin, after using commandeered gold, blissfully forgot about it until apparently he was a great reader of American Westerns, and a particular writer named Bret Harte. And he read about the California gold rush and began excavating again in Siberia after the gold producers had shut down in Tsar's times. And by 1938, the Soviets were producing $183 billion worth of gold, despite constantly in the press calling it a capitalist tool. We know the extremely sad history of gold confiscations by Hitler's regime, and this didn't end with confiscations domestically. And it is part, in fact, a repeated theme amongst many people who are anti-gold, is also associated with anti-Semitism and dislike of capitalism in general. And these two things are very closely associated. And again, I think it's because gold is effectively a symbol of freedom, and it is a critique on government. It is a critique not just on government economic policy, but also on government political policy. You know, we've done some very rough work, and we tend to find that during periods of high levels of dissatisfaction, at least in the United States, but also from other countries, that the gold market tends to do well. And one of the ways we looked at this was through the popularity of elected leaders. And as one might expect, the popularity of President Clinton and Ronald Reagan were the two highest in post-war US, and gold reached lows under both presidents. Gold began to go down under Reagan after peaking in 1980, and it proceeded to fall very heavily under the Clinton administration. It rallied again under the last Bush, and rallied again under Donald Trump, who persistently, by the way, also made mixed comments on gold. It was hard to figure out whether Mr. Trump is pro or anti-gold, but certainly Churchill was very pro-gold, as his sentiments during Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s showed. De Gaulle very cleverly used Bretton Woods and represented the United States with surplus dollars in order to get gold back. Ronald Raegan went so far as to very closely identify gold with freedom, as did Margaret Thatcher. Bismarck very cleverly said that he believed it would always be the basis of sound money. And you know, it's just fascinating to see how this has weaved through societies. Those like Henry VIII, for example, that attempted to debase coinage and therefore promote inflation unknowingly, had also made negative comments on both gold and silver and how he was strapped in by the moneylenders. But I think it's been clear, and one of the quotes when I was looking up some comments about thinkers and statesmen and economists who had said positive things or anti things about gold, I was very surprised to see that Ralph Waldo Emerson, the spiritualist really in the United States, made the quote that the desire for gold is not for gold, it is for the means of freedom and benefit. And I think that is absolutely brilliant. Santayana, the philosopher, said gold is tried and accepted by men because it has been through the furnace of adversity, which is truly interesting. I also thought that David Ricardo's comments was that the value of gold is not intrinsic, that its value is it is scarcity and its labor and the value of those put on it to receive it. Now there's many more comments, but I thought also some of the most interesting one was from Alan Greenspan at the end, who said, this seems to make sense, that gold and economic freedom are inseparable. And so I think it's therefore quite clear that those who try to manage the economy, try to manage people, try to put in programs, massive social experiments, be they of the right or of the left, will continually be the enemy of gold. In all cases, and many other, the list could have gone on and on, reprehensible people like Pol Pot and people like that, but I kept the list to what it was. But I think it's very clear that who's on which side, and although certainly some bad eggs have been on the pro-gold side, and a few very good eggs certainly have been on the anti-gold side. I think the weight of history is really very, very clear. And again, it just also shows the hypocrisy of some leaders who are willing to deface gold publicly, but on the other hand, use it to support their regimes, as was done in the Soviet Union, the early days of communist China, and also certainly fascist Italy and Germany. And I promised Edel is a very harsh taskmaster, and I promised her that I would keep my comments to 1:20 at the most. So Edel, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I'll forgive you calling me Eileen, but we'll move on from that.
A strikingly very beautiful woman that I knew at one time. And I think that for the
well, I won't ask you about how that relationship with your first girlfriend went after that story. But just to remind people that if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Jim, thank you for bringing us on that really interesting journey through history. And I guess having been an analyst in a previous life, I'm just curious as to where you get your inspiration, because I know from a day-to-day perspective of following the markets and trying to forecast where everything is going to be, whether it's tomorrow or in 2 or 3 years' time. What inspires you to look back through economic history? Is it your own natural tendencies, or is there client interest in much of this as well?
Well, I think it's always good to know, the raison d'etre of what you're doing, to see if it has any ultimate benefit, if it is something really worthwhile. And to me, something that has a 5,000-year-old longevity, and as I said, is quoted in virtually every spiritual text for thousands of years, and has been so instrumental. We know that it was the search for silver and gold that led to the exploration of the American continents of Australasia and Southern Africa. They didn't go there for the buffalo, and this led me to think, because one hears so much negative propaganda about gold from ill-informed sources, and I began to think, well, let's consider the source. Who is it that doesn't like gold? And again, you are associated by those around, by the company that you keep, and it became clearer and clearer to me that both on the right and on the left, I had no truck with anyone that was truly anti-gold, and not much truck with some of the pro-gold people either, but most of them I do. So that's where I got the idea that let's do a larger sweep. The following speakers are going to have something much more material on the immediate market, but I just thought it was something novel to discuss.
Absolutely. And were any of the significant leaders throughout history absent? As in, were they indifferent to gold? Anybody stand out? You mentioned Trump briefly, but Trump aside, were there any other of the leaders conspicuously absent by simply being indifferent to gold?
I think the most interesting about Donald, in addition to his hair, was the color that his paintings of his buildings, the color that his buildings are painted all throughout New York are clearly gold. We do find it discussed less and less after the gold standard, after Bretton Woods declined, and so gold has moved away from being a critical centerpiece to an important subset, is how I would put it. I mean, but we still see that gold was used during the ASEAN crisis in 1997 to 99. The Koreans mobilized gold very effectively. Other countries have mobilized gold since. Gold has been used as a political weapon since, but it has, I think actually it's gone to a more normal state rather than being central to everything, which it was for over 100 years. It's taken its rightful place and has maybe could get more visibility than it has now, but I think it's a much more sensible. I mean, I did a search of academic papers on gold once, and I found that 80% of them are just about the gold standard. And and of course I read some of the fine ones you've produced, Edel, which I would encourage everybody to look up.
In my previous life, yes. We have 1 or 2 questions coming in, Jill. I'll just ask you one of them before we move on to Paul. So do you think this is correlation or causality? Gold performs when the perception of the state of the economy declines, and when the economies decline, government approval ratings decline too.
Well, I think it's clearly tied to the economy. It is Bill Clinton, for example, maintained relatively high approval ratings. They went down. They went down, by the way, in every country in the world except for France during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which I thought was highly amusing. And although his popularity went down, it remained very high by historical standards. And that did not impinge the gold price. So it's quite clear that, and also Ronald Raegan, even periods when his popularity dipped, the gold market consistently went down. And so I think it's very much a question of of a reflection of how the economy is doing by far, and that feeding into the popularity of elected leaders. And it isn't just the case for the US. When we weighted it by globally, we found the same thing. For example, during periods of stress, coin and bar demand went up in Germany during unification, for instance, to record levels.
Okay, I lied. So there's one more question I wanted to ask you. It's an interesting one that's coming in, asking also about crypto. So gold has the history, but crypto is making new history as a growing, reliable hedge to most of the same thing that gold stands for. So anti-government, anti-system, inflation, fiat hedge. How do you see this demographic threat, and how is the industry thinking about it?
Well, we did a paper, gold and cryptocurrencies, I think in August, where it wasn't like much of my research. It was not original in the least. It took I read about 10 academic papers that had been written on cryptos and gold, or just cryptos, and looked at it. And you know what we found, the weight of opinion, and it's what I believe as well, is that cryptos are not a substitute for gold. And one of the reasons that they're not, and the central reason they're not a substitute for gold, is that you buy gold in order to have a physical presence. You know, we keep it in our vaults, other banks keep it in their vaults, you keep it at your home, and this will never be the case with cryptos. I'm not saying I'm not pro or anti-crypto. I'm just mentioning that this is a key difference. The other thing as well is, and I didn't want to give the wrong impression maybe, because one of the questioners said that, you know, gold is anti-government. I did not mean to give, if I did not mean to give that impression.
I think it's their view
of government. Gold is anti-bad government, and gold is anti-despots, but it is not anti-government overall. It works quite well, as we've seen for the past 20 years in China, for instance, works very well with government, you know, who've allowed, liberalized the gold market, et cetera, et cetera. So I do see a division. Yes, there is certainly a demographic difference. My children understand, subnormal as they are, my children understand cryptos probably better than me. But I don't see them replacing at all, if that's the underlying tone of the question. And certainly cryptos might be making new history, but they don't. Nothing has longevity of gold or silver. Nothing.
Yeah. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
So we'll move on to Paul Fisher. Paul's presentation is entitled "A Sustainable Strategy for the Precious Metals Industry." Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Edel. And if Tony, if you could just allow me to start my video, I can't start it. Thanks. Okay, but let me start. Sorry, I can't start my video. Right, there we are. Great, thank you very much. Well, this is an extremely important topic we're going to talk about. I've only got 20 minutes today, so what I want to do is these three things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about why we need a sustainability strategy for the precious metals industry. Then I want to talk about some of the threats and opportunities that arise to the industry. And then I'm going to end with some of the things we could do. And in particular, I'm going to end in my final slide with the potential outline of what might be in an industry-wide transition plan. So if we could go to the first slide, I can probably, oh, there we go, great. So I'm going to start back. Where does sustainability stem from? I'm not going to start with ESG considerations, which is really something that comes from the equity and investment industry and is rather a narrow approach to the subject. I always go back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were established in 2015, endorsed by every country that's in the United Nations for implementation by 2030. And there's well over 100 different targets associated with the development goals. And eventually our sustainability strategies are going to have to include all of these elements. But I'm going to start today with the one that's probably the most urgent and in the news, which is climate action, which is goal 13. But if we can move on, thank you. Why is this urgent? This is a chart of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. It's not the only greenhouse gas. We've got methane is a large part as well. But you clearly see here what has happened. We have this massive buildup in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, which is acting, as you all know, as a blanket, which is keeping heat in the planet and leading to global warming. Now, the point about this chart really is not to generate that, but to point out that the current discussion at international level is all about net zero commitments, i.e. leading to net zero carbon emissions, which is fine. But what that would achieve is for us to stop at a point right at the top of this graph. It would leave the stock of carbon in the atmosphere broadly unchanged at that level, which is something like 80% higher than the average of what it has been over the last 800,000 years. And people are slowly beginning to appreciate that the long run solution here is that we're going to have to take carbon, the greenhouse gases, out of the atmosphere and get back down to something like these levels that we had before. So net zero is a waypoint, it's not the end point, and net zero is going to be tough enough. But if we can move on to the next slide, temperature. This is what's been happening to global temperature. All the targets on global warming are set in relation to the average between 1850 and 1900 back here. And depending which data set you look at, we are currently something like 1.1 to 1.2 degrees warmer than we were back in that period. There are a number of things you can take away from this chart, one of which is just the sheer volatility of temperature from year to year. And it's the spikes in temperature which tend to cause climate events which cause the risk. And the more you look over shorter periods or different geographies, the more volatile these numbers become. And although people look at what the climate trends are going forward, it's actually the volatility that's going to generate financial losses before we get to the overall rise in the trend. But the other thing I want to look at is what's the trend here? Because, and if we can go to the next slide, if you try to look at a trend on this going back to, say, 1900, it's odd. You can't really see a close linear trend or any sort of fixed trend over that period. You go on to the next slide. Actually, what it looks like is up to about the early to mid 70s, very difficult to say there was any sort of global change in temperature of significance at all. Most of it has occurred since then and has been very rapid, which is actually more worrying than a long, slow trend upwards would have been. And so that's why this is now becoming increasingly urgent and people have woken up to the challenge in the last few years. If we can go on to the next slide, please. This is why the pace of climate change has accelerated. If this is the actual chart of global emissions over the last few hundred years, and what you can see is the huge pickup post Second World War, and in particular the increasing emissions coming from China and other Asian countries. Now, this chart isn't to apportion blame. The vast majority of carbon emissions has come from Europe and the United States, and indeed a lot of the emissions from somewhere like China will be in their exports to support the consumers in the United States and Europe. But the problem is, even though officially the carbon emissions are going down in the United States and Europe, they are rocketing upwards elsewhere. So that's the problem. And the issue for the precious metals industry is, do we want to be seen as part of the solution to this, or do we want to be seen as part of the problem? And I want to make a few comments about the reasons why we need to have a sustainability strategy for the precious metals industry. And Taylor, if you could take the slides off, stop sharing for a moment, I'm just going to talk to the screen for a little while. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why we need to be worried about this, and different reasons push different people's buttons. Each of these reasons is sufficient in its own right if you accept it. So the first reason why we should tackle this is it's the right thing to do. You can argue it's a social, moral, ethical issue that we leave behind a planet that's suitable for future generations to live in. And it's true. But perversely, people working in industry and financial markets in particular often react to that by simply saying, well, then it's an issue for government, it's not an issue for me. So let's leave that on one side for a moment. A second reason why we should tackle it is that we will get told to. Governments will insist, there will be regulators, there will be end users, everybody putting pressure on us to insist that we make changes to make the industry more sustainable. And that's fine, but if people follow that route, they tend to do the least possible at the last moment, rather grudgingly, and it can also be the most expensive way to react because you don't get any control over what you're doing. So the third reason I think is much more convincing, which is it's actually in the precious metals industry's own commercial interest to tackle this agenda. If we get it right, the industry can flourish. We can show we are part of the solution. That can increase the demand for gold. And so that's the approach we should take, I think, to sustainability generally. We should be trying to promote the industry as an example of what can be achieved. Now, if I just look back, what are the problems we have to tackle? And we do have some weaknesses. The main one, I suppose, is energy usage. Whatever part of the industry you're in upstream, whether you're in mining, refining, or transportation, gold is quite energy intensive. Now, clearly things can be done about that, both reducing energy usage and switching to renewable energy, but that's a large part of our challenge. The second and third parts of our challenge are really to do with the physical impact on the land use, particularly from mining. From large scale mining, clearly you dig big holes in the ground and that can be seen as a bad thing. But those holes in the ground can be rectified later. It's not a permanent scarring. And the way we do that matters. So that's one of the issues we can look at. Another one is illegal mining, particularly small scale mining, which doesn't come under our rules or come under any of our members, but it is our problem, even if it's not directly under our control, because reputation matters and the illegal sourcing of gold is going to be a problem for us that we need to try and do our best to contribute to controlling. Now, we've also got a very odd public perception, actually, which reacts nicely to what James was saying. The public are actually fascinated by gold generally, for the most part, and that can be something which we can play onto our advantage. But looking the other way, you can see quite a lot of greed associated with gold in history, whether you look at King Midas through to the conquistadors in Spain or some more recent examples. So there is both sides of the coin on public perception. But we do face some threats as a result of all these issues. Mining could be seen in the same light as fossil fuels. And if it is, then we're really in a bad place. People may just think anything that digs stuff out of the ground is bad, not sustainable, and has to be stopped. And we will be forever fighting on the back foot if that is the case. Regulation is important. If we don't regulate ourselves and come up with the standards and take action, it's an invitation to somebody else to do so. And if we get regulation imposed upon us, far from our own regulations, which are intended to support the industry and drive it forward, the unintended consequences of regulations set by those who do not have the best interests of the industry at heart could be quite damaging. So that's the worst outcome. We could scare off demand if we have too many negative stories. I say reputation is everything. If we can create the right reputation for gold as a sustainable asset, then that would be hugely advantageous. One of the aspects of the climate challenge is an increasing focus by individual countries on preserving their own natural resources and not letting others exploit them. We could see a move towards more attempts to nationalize international assets within national boundaries. And we have to watch out for that. So we do have to make sure in every jurisdiction we're operating with the consent of the local government and wider society. And finally, one of the threats is that at the moment we have, relative to other markets, relatively little market fragmentation. Most markets are fragmented in various ways, but if we can't implement a common approach, that risks greater fragmentation. So that's a quick through some of the risks and threats that the industry faces if we don't get this agenda right. But we've also got quite a lot of strengths. So gold itself as an investment has quite a lot of strengths. In particular, it's a very homogeneous product, which adds liquidity. An ounce of gold is pretty much an ounce of gold. Even if you have different levels of purity, it's quite easy to make gold fungible. And much more so than people don't realize, equities are not very homogeneous, bonds are not very homogeneous, even currencies are not very homogeneous by comparison. Gold famously has no credit risk and actually acts to diversify risks from things like inflation. And it could possibly act as a diversification from the risks from the transition to net zero if we get it right. If gold is seen as part of the solution, people want to hold it as part of their transition portfolio. And once gold is mined and it's sitting in a vault, it has a very low carbon footprint to maintain it as an investment asset, unlike almost other investment assets. The key challenge for us is the carbon that's embodied in the gold in the first place. But once you've got that, it's relatively low carbon. On the industrial side, there are some advantages. There are technological aspects of precious metals, which I'm not an expert on, which could make them extremely valuable in the technologies we need to achieve the net zero transition. The conductor properties, the super catalytic properties that gold has, and we need to exploit those as much as possible. On the more social aspects of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the impact of large-scale mining can be very positive. Companies are often working in very poor areas where they can offer jobs, they can offer good health, they can offer a degree of law and order, which wouldn't be there in the absence of those mines. Now, it can swing the other way on occasions, let's acknowledge that. But if responsible mine owners do their job properly, it can actually be quite a positive impact on the local economy. The final one is that relative to other industries, we have a tremendous opportunity to promote the circular economy. And Taylor, if you could just share the slides again. That's great. The circular economy is a little bit more complicated than most people presume. So I've just got this little model here, and you can go online and Google all sorts of models for the circular economy. It's not just about recycling. It's about repairing, reusing, refurbishing, and recycling, all in order to minimize the possibility of incineration or landfill. And of course, in the case of gold, that's the least good use of gold. You don't want to end up, you can't really destroy it, but you certainly don't want to end up putting it into landfill. And something like my broad estimate is around a third of demand for gold, sometimes more, can be met from recycled sources. And a lot of the world's biggest refiners simply refine recycled gold in some of those plants. So we actually have a good story to tell about the abilities of recycling and reusing gold. And then if we go on to organization, actually we have better governance than most industry sectors in the economy, in most financial sectors. We do have responsible gold sourcing guidance. And if you compare that with most industries that produce commodities, ours are probably much better and more rigorously enforced and enforceable than almost any other sector. We've also demonstrated the ability to coordinate and provide data on gold and come together. And it's not a zero-sum game. We all gain if the market works better. And so we have an actual natural interest to come together as an industry to promote gold. So what can we actually do? Well, we need to tackle weaknesses. We definitely need to tackle the post-mining landscape and generate good stories wherever we can. For example, one could think about applying rewilding to mine sites once they're finished, or perhaps they could be used as carbon sinks, intensive carbon sinks, if we are creative with those opportunities. We can definitely embrace the transformation of renewable energy. A lot of activities take place in very hot countries, which would be natural for solar activity, for example. And actually, you can get more energy security if you get the right combination. And it's not just solar energy or wind power. There are other options like hydrogen fuel cells and things could be brought in. And so it's likely to be a blended solution. We could definitely improve our communications as an industry generally about the positive side of gold. Not many people know very much about gold unless they happen to be in the market. That's quite clear. And we can also address the policies on supporting artisanal mining, which has become increasingly into focus over the last 2 years, and trying to get artisanal mining into the legitimate sector and away from the illegitimate sector will be a huge win for the industry. Now, there's a couple of things we can actually put in a sustainability strategy. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that companies can do clearly is commit to disclose in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I've put up here the various things one is supposed to disclose at a high level. Now, the importance of this is that most of the big banks will already have committed to this voluntarily. In the UK and in Europe, governments have promised to make disclosures in line with TCFD recommendations mandatory. In fact, greater disclosures. So this is something that's coming. I imagine that in more and more jurisdictions around the world will move towards making these disclosures mandatory, and the sooner the industry can move towards adopting it voluntarily, the easier it will be when we get there. But let's have a look at the last slide, which is really where I want to in terms of a strategy. And I think one of the things we are missing at the moment as an industry is that we don't have an industry-wide transition plan, and individual firms don't have transition plans. What we tend to get is a set of promises or a set of actions which are individually fine, but we don't make it overall coherent. Now, a strategy, in my view, should be something relatively simple that we could all memorize. And I've just put a straw man on the top of this slide. And so one strategy would be to contribute meaningfully to climate change mitigation, and do that in a way which increases the demand for precious metals by acting ahead of regulatory and legal requirements. And I think those are three components of what the industry strategy is to be. We have to make sure we do the right thing, which is the first clause. We want to avoid being told what to do by regulators, so we want to get ahead of them, which is the third clause. And we want to do this in order to maximize the opportunities for the industry, which is the second clause. So I think those are the three sorts of components we need to build into a strategy. We would need to make some commitments. They would probably start off by being voluntary. Disclosures in line with or going beyond TCFD would be a good step for most in the industry. And I note with approval that the World Gold Council has already committed its members to making disclosures consistent with TCFD. This is actually a big ask. It's a lot harder to do than people might think. And I know many people have spent some years trying to get themselves TCFD compliant. So that would be quite a big achievement. But a slightly bigger achievement will be to target net zero carbon emissions by 2050-60. And I put that down because at the moment, China has a 2060 target, whereas Europe has gone for 2050. And so we might need to allow people to align with their own national target levels. But it's no good having a target if you don't know how you're going to get there. And so the transition plan would map out what the actions were which you had to take to get from where we are today to hitting these commitments. And we need those transition plans both enterprise-wide and industry-wide. And this may again become mandatory. The Sustainable Disclosure Reporting Initiative that's going on in the UK, a requirement for transition plans was mentioned in the government's announcement. And so we may find if we don't do this voluntarily that we get told to. And what we need to do is certainly coordinate the whole of the industry. And this is a prime opportunity for LBMA and World Gold Council to work together or for the good of the industry as a whole. We need better communications to highlight the good that gold industry can do and not just the downsides. We are in a position to have the governance to track and enforce whatever is decided. Now, at the moment, I would suggest that this is going to be voluntary. So it's more a case of tracking it. But I think this would be a sample. We need to do a lot more work on an industry-wide transition plan, But I do think this is the way forward, and hopefully I've given some reasons today why we need to be getting on with this. So you can stop there.
Thank you, Paul. Just a question or two, Paul, if I can. So you were suggesting that an industry-wide transition strategy is necessary that includes firm-level commitments to net zero and TCFD compliance. The LBMA released its responsible goal guidance version 9 on Monday. Where do you see that fitting into this overall strategy?
I think the responsible goal guidance is an important part of the strategy, but this is something which applies particularly to LBMA members, and it is a requirement for LBMA members to make sure that their gold is responsibly sourced. It would be going, I think, at this stage, going beyond the LBMA's remit to require companies to disclose alongside TCFD lines, because it's going a bit outside the purposes of the gold industry or responsible gold guidance. But we need to find out which of our members have already become TCFD compliant and whether we can encourage them to that. And it could certainly be a positive policy. But I don't see us at the moment changing responsible gold guidance to include these targets, even if it's something we think we need to advise on and encourage firms to adopt.
Okay. And I guess if we step back from, because we're quite inside the gold industry, but for outsiders looking into the gold industry as a whole, how are we ranking versus other sectors who also have targets that as an industry they aspire to achieve?
It's very interesting. At the moment, gold is not the focus of attention. It's sort of been left on one side. People are tackling different issues, and the lens this is being looked at internationally is mostly through the green taxonomies, which are being developed in Europe and in the UK, slightly in a very similar way, but slightly separately. And precious metals, as far as I know, is not covered by these green taxonomies yet. It probably would be a good idea if it was in due course, because then people could label their gold assets as green, which they couldn't do if it's not covered by the taxonomy. But at the moment, it hasn't been focused attention. People are focused on things like gas and nuclear and whether things which are currently emitting carbon but could transition should be included. So the focus is on other bits of the economy at the moment. But I do think it's going to be the case that we're going to require transition plans for every sector of the economy eventually. And I can see that being a requirement. I can certainly see it being a requirement quite soon for individual firms, large firms in particular, to have their own transition plan. And I think it'd be very helpful for firms if their industry bodies come together to give an overall industry plan into which a firm can set its own. I think it'll help inform the firms. One of the lessons in this subject is that nobody has the ability and the knowledge to tackle climate change on their own. No one firm, even the big banks, tend to work in coalitions with other people, whether that's in academia or with NGOs or with others or with peers, often people they would normally be competing against to come up with solutions. And that applies to gold, because this is going to affect all of the industry associations around the world that are relevant. And the gold industry itself could learn a lot by sharing knowledge and expertise across. And one way of embodying that is in an industry-wide transition plan. Okay.
And then I guess broader again, what did you think of COP26? Did it go far enough?
It's interesting. I was on a webinar a week or so ago, and the debate was about whether COP6 was a glass half full or a glass half empty. And my answer was it was both. So there were some good things which went in the right direction. There were some things where they could have gone further and didn't. So we're making progress on coal, but it seems to me that one of the most obvious things is that we should not be burning coal, full stop. Yes, you can argue about whether you could produce coal that's cleaner and so on, but we need to be getting out of using coal as soon as we can, and not every country in the world has yet signed up for that. But that it's the dirtiest of the fuels, and it should be the first fossil fuel to go. And we aren't quite there. We've made progress, but we aren't quite there. So it's sort of what happened at COP was useful. It was in the right direction, but we need to go a lot further. It's not going to stop there.
Do you think that will happen for the next one?
The problem is we keep making progress, but when you stop to look where we are, it's not clear yet that global carbon emissions are going down, let alone on a track to net zero. And just we don't start from a great place. Some aspects of climate change would be reversible, but some aspects aren't. The melting of the ice sheets and glaciers and Antarctica and so on, it would take thousands and thousands of years for those to be rebuilt. And so certainly for our lifetimes in the foreseeable future, those impacts are not reversible. Sea level rise is not going to reverse quickly. Two, the biggest capitals in the world, Philippines, Manila and Jakarta, are sinking. And they've already announced that Jakarta is going to move to higher ground on the island of Borneo because of that. Part of that is sea level rise, part of it is excessive water extraction. But basically, it's all about unsustainable human activity causing those. And that is going to get repeated across a lot of coastal cities around the world, displacing millions of people.
So much needs to be done, but I guess we have to start and keep pushing. Okay, thank you, Paul. Perfect. Our next speaker today is Matthew Turner. Matthew is from Anglo American, and his presentation is Pgms and hydrogen getting real. So keeping, I guess, on that sustainability theme. Matthew, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Edel. Just going to start my video. So, as Edel said, my name is Matthew Turner. I'm the Market Intelligence Manager at Anglo American. It's great to be here today. Shame it's not in person, and a definite shame not going for the dinner, but online does have its advantages too, and I thank the LBMA for the opportunity. So today I want to talk about platinum group metals and hydrogen. Now, listening to Jim, I have to say neither platinum nor hydrogen were mentioned in the Bible because they were discovered in the 18th century. But you've probably heard a bit about them at various conferences over the years. And I wouldn't forgive you for saying, not again. What more is there to be said? Well, that's why I've titled the presentation Getting Real, because the demands of net zero that Paul has spoken about means that hydrogen is becoming a real growth story for PGM demands at last. But also we need to get real about what the potential is and what we can do to help it along. So let's just start with some background information, because I have to say, when I first looked at this subject, I found it quite complicated. Taylor, I'm having problems changing the slide. Okay, great. So I think the first thing to note is that although people talk about hydrogen as being a fuel of the future, and some jokes are that it always will be, there's already a growing and sizable hydrogen economy. It's just PGM only play a small part in it. So 70 million tons of hydrogen are produced and consumed every year. And it's used as a chemical. It's a chemical feedstock for oil refining and to produce ammonia for fertilizer. And it's made, and hydrogen has to be made. That's the important thing to think about. It's made using natural gas or coal primarily, or as a byproduct of industrial processes. And as I said, it hasn't really got much to do with PGMs. There is some PGM demand, but it's pretty small, maybe 50,000 ounces a year or something. So, what is all the fuss about? Carry on the next slide, thanks. So the fuss is about green hydrogen and net zero. These are game changers. So Paul covered net zero, but I think it's crucial to point out that the commitment government, society and businesses are making has really energized the search for the ways in which a whole range of sectors can be decarbonised. Now, what about green hydrogen? Well, green hydrogen, sorry, can I go back to the previous slide? Green hydrogen is two things. First, it's hydrogen, exactly the same as what is now called grey hydrogen, and it's green. Of course, it's not literally green. The green means that it's made using green methods, electrolysis of water by electrolyzers, and those are powered by renewable energy. Now, this has two big implications. The first is it can decarbonize the existing hydrogen sector, and that's no small feat, because the existing hydrogen sector produces more CO2 than Germany. But also, and I think more fundamentally, is it means far more hydrogen could be consumed. And not as a chemical, but as an energy source or energy vector. And what that means is essentially you can burn hydrogen relatively cleanly, so it makes it a sort of cleaner version of a fossil fuel, or you can turn it back to electricity in a fuel cell, which makes the green hydrogen more like a battery. Now, why do we care? Next slide, please. Well, we care because here's where PGMs come in at both ends of the equation. One of the main types of electrolyzers to make the green hydrogen, called PEM electrolyzers, use iridium and platinum. And as is widely known, many types of fuel cells, including PEM fuel cells, use a lot of PGMs on their catalysts. Now, both sectors are currently quite small, but they could be very big. So how do we go about assessing this? Let's start with production of hydrogen. So next slide, please. Essentially, it's a series of questions. So the biggest question is how much hydrogen will be demanded? There's lots of potential to use hydrogen once it's an energy vector. So you can use it in steel making or heating or power generation or transport and energy storage. But at the moment, most of these sectors are quite small. So that's a difficult thing to judge. Then you have to ask how much green hydrogen we needed. So that's the same question as how much hydrogen is produced by electrolyzers. Now, the demands of net zero are not really compatible with current grey hydrogen because it's produced by fossil fuels, but it might be with what's called blue hydrogen, which is fossil fuel produced hydrogen where the carbon is captured. Then you need to know how much will be produced by PEM electrolyzers. So there are other types of electrolyzer, including alkaline electrolyzers, and there's other methods of making green hydrogen that could be developed. And finally, how much PGM will be on those PEM electrolyzers. So at the moment, the loadings of iridium and platinum are quite high on PEM electrolyzers, but they are falling over time, something that we welcome as a way of making the technology more competitive. So today, I haven't got much time. I'm going to focus on the forecasts for how much green hydrogen will be needed or how much electrolyzer capacity. It's the same question. So next slide, please. So if you just go on one. Thanks. So today, there's 290 megawatts of electrolyzer capacity installed, 0.29 gigawatts, and that produces just 50,000 tons of green hydrogen a year. That's less than 1% of the global total hydrogen. And only a third of that is PEM. So probably the PGMs installed in this is less than 5,000 ounces, but there's tremendous momentum here. If we look at what's likely for the next 2 years, we'll see that Bloomberg New Energy Finance say that by 2022, 1.8 gigawatts of capacity will be installed. So 6 times higher than today. And a lot of that will be PEM. I mean, only last week, there was 100 megawatt PEM plants announced in Egypt for installation next year. That's bigger than the existing capacity of PEM. And then by 2030, these forecasts become higher and uncertain really. So the IEA says 54 gigawatts, so 54,000 megawatts of capacity is in development by 2030, and 100 gigawatts or 100,000 megawatts has been announced. And then if we go next slide, next one, thank you. They say that by 2030, to be on target for net zero, you would need 850 gigawatts of capacity, which is actually quite similar to what you'd need if you replaced all the grey hydrogen with electrolyzer produced green hydrogen. And then by 2050, they say that the world needs 3,600 gigawatts. That's 10,000 times the current level. So you can see how even with thrifting, this could be a big source of PGM demand, hundreds of thousands of ounces. But of course, it's not going to happen overnight. Some of these targets will need huge amounts of investment. And to put it in context, global solar and wind power, both about 750 or 800 gigawatts. So we are talking big figures here. But what's made it possible is that drive for net zero and the realization that in some industries, there aren't many other options. So go to the next slide. What about fuel cells? Well, fuel cells, I guess you'd say, are a perennial disappointment for the PGM market. But here too, we do see meaningful commercialization in the next few years. Now, fuel cells have a wide variety of applications and go hand in hand with green hydrogen if that green hydrogen is being used like a battery. But of course, here there are alternatives. There are batteries themselves. Transport is a good example. So, this is a sector that needs decarbonisation. Everyone thinks electrification is the long-term future, but there are many ways to electrify it. The rule of thumb, we think, as shown in this chart, is the larger the vehicle, the longer the necessary range, and also crucially how heavily they are used, the more fuel cells will be suited. Some of the uses shown in this chart are pretty embryonic, like aviation, and aren't going to trouble the supply-demand balance for 10 or 20 or 30 years. But trucks and buses, which fit all the criteria, are nearing commercialization. Most major truck companies, including the largest like Daimler, have fuel cell plans that they've committed to recently. And in 2022, there will be commercial vehicles on the market. Trucks alone, can produce a meaningful contribution to PGM demand. This is mainly platinum here, again, of hundreds of thousands of ounces a year. But the great prize still remains light vehicles. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, Taylor. There's still uncertainty about the role fuel cells can play in automobiles. This is the Electro van. It was made in the 1960s by General Motors and was the world's first fuel cell powered automobile. In reality, it was really the first automobile shaped fuel cell. It only had room for one passenger, but it had a range of 120 miles and a top speed of 70 miles an hour. So it's a pretty impressive vehicle for the time. The downside was it required huge amounts of platinum. Only one man knew how to drive it, and it took 3 hours to start. Now, things have moved on a long way for fuel cell electric vehicles. Go to the next one. Modern fuel cell electric vehicles have had excellent reviews. The range is good, the power is good, the handling is good. The problem is, though, that battery electric vehicles, next, please, Taylor, have also moved on a long way. And of course, they have a ready-built charging infrastructure for some people, and at the moment are being prioritized by most of the major automobile manufacturers. Now, I think it'd be too soon to rule out fuel cells still taking a sizable market share in light vehicles. Battery electric vehicles do remain substandard to ICE vehicles and fuel cell vehicles in some key ways, and a lot can change in 10 years. But it's clear that while the potential for PGM demand is even higher in fuel cells and electrolyzers, the momentum at the moment is less strong. Now let's turn to see what Anglo American is doing about both these sectors. So there's three things really. The two things are here. Essentially, shape the business and shape the business environment. So by shape the business, we mean market development. So we explore, launch, invest in businesses and partnerships that could be using or enabling PGMs. And a lot of these are in the hydrogen space. AP Ventures is one I'm sure you're aware of. Shaping the business environment is slightly different. That's advocacy, education, and communication. So in terms of advocacy, most of the net zero framework is set by governments, and policy is going to be a key driver moving forwards. So what we want to do is just make sure hydrogen has a fair chance, really. And in terms of education, well, it's two-way, really. So, and this is where I come in partly, because on the market intelligence side, we need to know how large this market is, how large it might become, how quickly it might become that size. And we need to communicate that to other parties within the industry about what we can produce and when we can produce it. So this kind of forum and customer meetings are all crucial, I think, to developing this sector. And then third, I think we can lead by example. So if we go to the next slide. Anglo American is committed to our own carbon neutrality target by 2040. And so we need to reduce carbon emissions. Heavy mining trucks are our single largest CO2 emitter. And so from what I said earlier about size and range and power, these are right for conversion to fuel cell hybrid power. I could go through this slide, but I've got a video I'm going to play now that shows how we and our partners are developing this fuel cell truck.
Mining sustains life on the planet. Most things that you can touch, you can feel, you can see, they are products of mining.
The challenge is to completely change the way we've been working for the past 100 years.
To mine a kilogram of copper 100 years ago to today, the amount of energy required has gone up 16 times, and that's unsustainable. Future smart mining is about changing that footprint, changing that trajectory.
When I interviewed for this job and I met Tony, I said, what is it you want to do? He goes, I want to disrupt the mining industry and make a real change. And that really resonated with me.
In looking at and doing our homework on the challenges, we believed that we could achieve carbon neutrality by 2040, so that became the commitment.
When we think about decarbonisation and new forms of energy, there's so many opportunities of creating a very different future for our communities and our children.
When looking at our mine sites globally, we realised that the best place to start was the diesel that we consume in our large mining trucks. They consume between 2,500 to 3,000 litres of diesel per day. We looked at, synthetic fuels, biofuels. When you start going through those options, you quickly realise that they're not the right solution.
The more we looked at hydrogen and its characteristics being very efficient form of transporting energy and also providing a very clean solution, it made sense on a lot of other fronts.
There was no hydrogen truck available in the industry. To address that issue, we had to do it ourselves. We have designed a hydrogen truck basically from scratch.
Converting a 300-ton haul truck to run on hydrogen fuel is not the low-hanging fruit of hydrogen vehicle conversions.
When you start pushing the boundaries of supply chains and the research and design that's been done, you really start testing the true limits of the technologies. Getting DT74 in South Africa to drive with our power plant is just the beginning. That's one truck. Anglo American's vision is much bigger than that. They're envisioning hundreds of trucks at mine sites all around the world.
By converting these diesel trucks to hydrogen, we'll be eliminating up to 80% of the emissions associated with diesel on each mine site.
We are busy with the installation of a 100 megawatt PV plant that will supply green energy to our electrolyzer to generate green hydrogen, making sure that the entire value chain ultimately is green.
We're addressing a carbon issue that we want to deal with internally, but there's also potentially a business opportunity beyond mining.
Hydrogen's almost like the Swiss Army knife of energy vectors. It can be used in many, many applications.
These designs can go into rail, they can go into ships, they can go into heavy industry.
As those applications all switch over, then the demand for hydrogen is going to increase significantly.
What's at stake for us here, if we really look very long term, is a future for our children. How do we shape the world we live in for our future generations?
If it's not companies like ours, who else will? That's a responsibility we feel very deeply.
Okay, thanks, Taylor. I think I thought that was a great video. I think it really gives an idea of the scale of the task, but also the scale of the opportunity. So let me just recap. I think I've explained, why we are getting real about hydrogen and how hydrogen is getting real as a demand sector for PGMs. It's not just about 2030 or 2050, but something that's happening now and will show up in demand in the next few years. But for those who still need some convincing, let me just leave you with this chart. So I think perceptions of potential hydrogen demand are already having an impact on the platinum price. Earlier this year, January, February, platinum went on a huge price run-up, hitting its highest price in 7 years. That coincided quite similarly with a gain for hydrogen company equity valuations, which is shown in green. And subsequently, as some of the hype over hydrogen has faded a bit, the platinum price has come down too. So I think it's not just something for a later date, it's something for now. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Matthew. That was really interesting. I love being brought back to PGMs. I miss it in my current day job. And especially that last chart linking the platinum price and hydrogen.
Classic analyst chart, Edel.
Oh, completely, yeah. And so you probably know my first question is going to be a classic analyst, as if you're feeling you're in one of the Johnson Matthey platinum launches. So you talked about potential demand for PGMs, particularly on the electrolyzer side. So you talked about hundreds of thousands of ounces. So I just wanted to ask you, so what's the breakdown here? This is, you're talking about platinum and iridium, but generally, what's that ratio? And can we just get a little bit more details on what that demand outlook may look like? Granted that it is a may look like situation right now.
Yeah, so we don't make electrolyzers, and I think the companies who do guard these secrets quite closely. But we've been working on a kind of ratio of 2 to 1 iridium to platinum in electrolyzers. We do that obviously, in a sense, puts a limit on how much demand can be, because the iridium market's much smaller than the platinum market. But we do expect to see considerable thrifting, and of course the attention of thrifting has been on iridium, not platinum. But we welcome this because it will ensure the technology's future to some extent. I do think, if you think back about autocatalysts, we talk about thrifting, but of course the emission standards get tighter and tighter, so the thrifting is offset. Yeah. Well, we're not talking, that's slightly different here. Yeah, perhaps you might want to add more PGM to make the catalysts more efficient, but you're not chasing an emissions target. So thrifting is ongoing. You see lots of press releases from companies saying they're doing it, it's trying to sort of, as an analyst, trying to work out the interaction of demand and thrifting, and other technologies. So there is other types of electrolyzer as well. So I think the first few years, so we're talking about growing from a small base. Yeah. So we're not talking about any real difficulties in the next 5 years.
Okay, and when you talk about hundreds of thousand ounces, is that at the lower end of the hundreds of thousands of ounces or the higher end?
It depends when and where. Yeah, we're assuming a sort of pretty steady increase in these electrolyzer installations. Yeah, and so your thrifting and your growth tends to sort of offset each other. But there's a very, very, very wide range here. Yeah, some of those higher end IEA targets would be much higher than 100,000 ounces. Yeah. But if they don't arrive to 2050, by then we'd expect thrifting to be much more aggressive. Yeah,
but I guess is this something that's and I guess if you include the fuel cell possibilities as well, is it something that the PGM producers, well, particularly the platinum, but obviously you have more than you have the related metals that will be mined alongside it. But is it enough to get them excited that there will be capital investment will be increased for PGM from PGM producing nations?
I think it's early days yet, and we're still debating what mix of metals will be required. I didn't cover all the different ways PGMs interact with the hydrogen economy. There are roles for palladium and ruthenium in things like storage and transport and purity. But at the moment, I think we're just focusing on the fact that it's going to be worthy of a separate demand line in the supply-demand balance. Yeah.
Okay, and you mentioned palladium there very briefly. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how that fits into the green economy, or is the focus very much on more platinum and iridium?
The focus is on platinum, iridium, ruthenium. Palladium does have good interactions with hydrogen, and that will give it a role. But I think that's really why I talked about AP Ventures and the stuff we do there. There's huge positive economies of scale here. If you get more trucks using hydrogen, you get more hydrogen filling stations, you get more rationale to have cars using hydrogen. If you get more green hydrogen being used in heating, you need more green hydrogen for other sources as well. So I think really, palladium is not its primary thing, hydrogen, but it will have a role in that if this sector gets as big as some of those forecasts say.
And I must confess, I don't know a huge amount about the iridium market, but from a supply point of view, how do its fundamentals stack up in terms of being able to support this demand? And also, does the price potentially cause a problem outside of obvious thrifting that has to happen?
Yeah, I think it's a small market, iridium, much more than platinum, and so there will need to be thrifting. It could be a pressure point, but as I say, PEM technology is only one type of electrolyzer. We do expect to see thrifting in this sector, and as far as we can see, there's already been considerable thrifting made of the iridium amounts. The price, I think, well, we had a big run up in the price this year. I don't think it was driven by electrolyzer demand, because if you look at the numbers, it's just not big enough. And we don't think price is the primary concern of the manufacturers. What they really care about is things like stability of supply and a lack of volatility in the price. And I think, moving forward, hopefully we'll see that.
Okay. Yeah, volatility. The fuel cells. So talking about their potential for many, many years, I'm curious to know where loadings are currently for heavy trucks. Are we at the point where it's commercially viable, or is that thrifting exercise still very much in flux?
So we've always based it on the long-standing US Department of Energy target, which is 0.125 grams per kilowatt, and then you need to work out how big your how big your engine is. But you end up with that's by 2030. You end up with less than a third of an ounce per truck or something like that. I was interested to see. I mean, at the moment loadings are higher because the production is quite small. You don't want your trucks to not work, and so it's not the primary concern at the moment. There are much more other costs that need to come down. I was interested, actually, Hyundai had a big hydrogen day in October, and they said that every truck they launched in future would have a fuel cell version. And they didn't spend too much time on platinum, actually. They basically said that other costs were more important now.
Okay.
I mean, remember, the platinum price is not that high.
Yeah.
Compared to some precious metals either. So it seems that it's not the primary focus now of reduction efforts. I mean, they've either been successful enough, or other costs can be more easily brought down. Okay.
Last question from me before we move on to Philip Newman. Can you replace platinum, iridium, or ruthenium? Are they interchangeable in terms of what happens with palladium and platinum with petrol and diesel, etc.?
Sorry, can you in fuel cells and electrolyzers? Can you? The first thing is there are technologies that don't use PGMs. So alkaline electrolyzers. There are fuel cells that don't use PGMs as well. But essentially, in the applications I've looked at, the PGM using ones are the more practical options to some extent. They're basically very good catalysts. So you could perhaps replace them if you do things that don't require as good a catalyst. You have higher temperatures and so on. But when we look at the applications such as renewable power generated electrolysis, and we look at transport applications such as fuel cells and cars and trucks, then the condition, it's a bit like with autocatalysts, the conditions in the laboratory aren't the same as the conditions in the real world. And so what you might be able to replace in the laboratory, you can't easily do in the real world. So, I mean, there's always, potential alternatives, but at the moment we don't see them. Okay, so that's too early in the story.
There is one question in the Q&A box, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer it with much certainty, but we'll ask nonetheless. So as things stand, how the average PGM usage in an internal combustion engine vehicle compared to an EV car, and compare that to a hydrogen vehicle, please? A rough percentage would do.
Well, as things stand, so I mean, I won't do it as things stand, as we'd expect it to be, in a few years' time, which is a standard ICE vehicle probably has, as its ROS, I do it in ounces, a fifth of an ounce of PGM. I'd imagine a fuel cell at the target of 2030 would be about a third of an ounce. And then if he means an EV car, as in a BEV car, at the moment, they don't use any PGM, although there are some technologies that could use PGM.
Okay. Ever changing though.
Ever changing, and also, these targets, the technology moves on in sort of spurts. You have loadings similar, and then they get cut, and you have improvements to designs and so on.
Yeah, and focus changes too in terms of what they're trying to target and where.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Matthew, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So moving on to our fourth and final speaker. So we have Philip Newman from Metals Focus talking about silver emerging from the pandemic, silver 2022 trends. Over to you, Philip.
Great, thanks very much, Edel, and good day, everyone. So what I want to do over the next few minutes, as Edel has said, is just give you a sense of where we see the silver market heading next year. I will be focusing very much on the demand side. So if you're interested on supply side, please perhaps drop me a line afterwards and I'll happily get in touch with you, put in touch with my colleagues. So in terms of this slide, what we're trying to do here is look at the top 4 countries in the silver market from a demand perspective. Just notice some of the legends may be missing, but just to let you know, the orange on the far side is looking at 2022. So really you get a sense of how some of the markets are performing quite differently. And just to be clear, we are combining industrial demand with jewellery, silverware, coin minting and bar demand as well. So very briefly, for the US, you can see apparently there was no impact or very little impact of the pandemic on silver use in the US. And I think that really reflects a couple of themes that will, I think, hopefully come true or come through really in the next few slides. Firstly, for industrial demand, many companies were deemed essential services. And so allowing for social distancing and other measures, they really kept producing throughout 2020. I think the other thing that really comes through is in terms of retail investment, a very strong period, both in terms of coin fab and also bar demand. But you can see that it wasn't the case just for 2020. We are expecting further upside this year and carrying through into next year as well. You contrast that very sharply with what's gone on in India, a very palpable decline. I think that really reflects a couple of themes. Firstly, we had the impact of restrictions. They came through quite heavily. I think it was back end of the first quarter of last year, applied nationwide, really affected the ability of people to go out and physically buy silver. The other thing, which was I think very important, was that in rupee terms, the silver price hit record highs. And so that really cut across really every area. So many of the manufacturing sectors in India are price sensitive, including important parts of the industrial landscape as well. We can see though how that's recovering this year. But I think what's also important, one of the key takeaways, and again, that will come through in the slides as well, is that it's not yet expected to get back to pre-pandemic levels, even by next year. And then finally, in terms of this slide for China and India, seemingly very little impact of the pandemic on the silver manufacturing sector. And I think, again, that owed a lot to the strength in the industrial landscape. And I think the other key takeaway from here is that you can see by next year, not only eclipsing pre-pandemic, but really getting back, or interested in getting, I think, in our view, to potentially record high levels as well. So to package this a little differently, we're going to look at some of the key end uses for silver industrial demand. One that we've shown many times before, updating it for our latest data, is in terms of the photovoltaic market, which I know Paul has touched upon as well. And I think this slide really reflects or shows the strength of this market. Not only the increasing annual gigawatts that are being installed, but also a number of countries that are really coming to the top table in terms of installing at least 1 gigawatt per annum. You can see how that's risen from just 2 countries in 2010 to 8 in 15, and to our expectations for this year of 24. Those of you who are perhaps more eagle-eyed, the pie chart for 2021 actually shows installations from last year for which we have hard data. But our expectation is that it will hit 24 countries this year. And that's important, not in terms of the amount of silver it's consuming, but also that it helps to insulate the market if one or two countries inadvertently step back. And we've seen that in the past, that when, for example, a recession hits, a country may be forced to renege on its subsidies to the PV market. But what we've seen, of course, is that with more countries stepping up, that diversity really helps to offset issues that may hit one market. But something else I want to touch upon before I move away from the PV industry is in terms of the potential for thrifting that we see on the left-hand side. So for this chart, I've very much just focused on the early years where that thrifting was at its height, which is shown by the orange bar. And you can see the very strong correlation with the silver price. Now, of course, the price here is only being shown on a quarterly average basis. The spot price was far higher, as many of you will know. What's also interesting, though, is not only was there an immediate reaction from the industry, but that thrifting has carried on. And in fact, if I had shown this chart through to 2021, we would still see thrifting this year and every year previously as well. It's not dramatic, but it still carries on. So really, industrialists remain wary of silver prices hitting highs or the return to some of these heightened volatility that we've seen before. And as many of you will know, that ultimately is demand destruction. Once it's gone, it's simply not coming back. So although we remain very positive towards the PV market and what that means for industrial demand, this is something I think we have to be mindful of. And especially when we come to later talking to some of the retail investment slides as well. So moving away from the PV market, staying with the industrial sector and looking at some of the other elements. What we're trying to show here is the impact of the disruptions that we've seen and also in terms of the chip shortage. So firstly, in terms of the smartphone market, which actually is the red line. So apologies if you can't see the legend for that. And so I guess a couple of key takeaways. First, we can see how the market is recovering from the pandemic. And secondly, the outlook for 2022, that will be up on those pre-pandemic levels, up around 4%. In terms of the PC market, and here we are including notebooks and tablets, you can see a far more remarkable picture in terms of that top line rising 16% on 2019. And understandably, that reflects in terms of the trend we've had to working from home in large part. A really interesting one is in terms of the auto market. The fact that we're still going to be down in terms of, in spite of that recovery, next year, still down on 2019 levels. And those of you that take some of our reports, our 5-year forecast, for example, will know that the figures that we reflect from LMC Automotive in terms of that ongoing downgrade in 2021 production. But what's interesting, though, from a silver point of view, is that the decline in silver demand from the automotive sector has been far softer than we've seen in 2020, and it's also outpacing the gains in 21 and going forward as well. And there's a very simple reason for that. As we look at the number of devices and utilities in cars that 5 or 6 years ago, or whatever it may be, used to be the preserve of the luxury vehicles, are increasingly available in the mass market. And then moving from an ICE vehicle to a hybrid to an electric vehicle, we believe that silver loadings will continue to strengthen as well. So this again is one of the positive elements of the market, and it's quite possible to believe, although it's very difficult to estimate, that this could be the second biggest use behind the automotive sector. So when we now package that up, and what does that mean for industrial demand? Many of the elements I just spoken about do drop into our electrical and electronics segment. And you can see here from a global basis, 2020 versus 19, almost no change. And I think that reflects the fact that most of the losses were concentrated in the first half. And as we moved through 2020, we certainly saw a very sharp recovery, which continued into this year. And you can see also that we are expecting further upside modestly, but we are looking at very elevated totals. If we now add on brazing alloys, yes, it's a small component, but also I think quite positive. We think of the focus on infrastructure in China. We add on the infrastructure bill that's recently been passed in the US. And I think these are quite positive developments for that marketplace. And then finally, in terms of the other industrial, which is the red segment on top of that, which really is a catch-all for a whole range of very small end uses. The largest one really is in the ethylene oxide. Now, just to be clear, this also captures the changeouts, which does boost the total very significantly. But if you look at the global total, we are expecting an 8% rise for this year, which most likely would have been considerably higher if we didn't have the disruptions and the chip shortage, but further growth next year as well. So building on these gains, and so another record total in our view for silver industrial demand in 2022. If you move away from this and look at the coin and bar market and the retail investment more generally, I mean, it feels a bit of like a lifetime ago, but it was only in January and February this year that we had the social media vehicle really sort of intruding or coming into the silver market. Huge bursts of activity, be it in coin and bar, ETF or mining equities, looking really to push the price dramatically higher. That didn't really happen. Silver barely got to about $30 and very briefly. But the impact on the silver market was, I think, far more long lasting in a couple of areas at least. The first one was in the coin and bar market. Here we are showing a number of key markets. We have the US, India and Germany. And then above that, actually, although it doesn't come through in the legend, we have Europe, other East Asia, then other as well. The main markets are being shown here, which is the important thing. And I think what was really interesting, both for 20 and this year, is that a lot of product shortages meant that these totals actually, if they'd been available, would have been far higher. But what's also interesting, you can see that we should be getting back next year to the 300 million ounce level, a total that we haven't seen since the early to mid 2015 or around there. And so if we look at one or two of these markets, the US, although the social media frenzy died down, I think relatively quickly, that was quickly picked up as well by, I would say, more mainstream investors. There was concern about the American Rescue Plan, the impact this would have on inflation, and that frenzy of buying wasn't limited to silver. Gold and platinum also really benefited. And in a sense, for a good number of months this year, really whatever a dealer had on the shelves didn't stay there for very long. And although that has died down in recent months, the new norm is really of heightened buying. Premiums still remain elevated as well. If you look at Germany, that has overtaken India to become the second largest market, something that Jim touched on in his presentation about the importance of gold in Germany. That certainly extends to silver as well. For India, though, really interesting development. From eye-watering total, you can see in 2019, almost disappearing last year, gradually returning this year and next. And what we saw is that the impact, as I mentioned earlier, of restrictions, you physically couldn't go out and buy silver. The record prices I mentioned, a lot of profit taking emerged, And so that's why it really depressed the net figure that you see here. Some of that net selling carried on into the early part of this year, and it's only been quite recently that the market has burst into life. And we are expecting, again, that strength to carry on, or that recovery to carry on into next year as well, quite importantly. But as I said, it wasn't just about the coin and bar market. It was also in the exchange traded product space, that huge jump you saw back in the January into early Feb. I'd suggest that those liquidations which emerged pretty quickly were concentrated in the institutional space, whereas the retail element that contributed to the upside, I think has become a lot, was really retained. Those holdings tend to be a lot stickier, and you certainly see that in recent months when the price has been quite volatile. The selling into that has, I think, been quite modest. So I've spoken about the Indian market, and I really could have put this slide in quite a few places. But I wanted to use this slide as we sort of move into or finish up really with the jewellery and silverware markets. This is showing the imports. We can see that explosion in September and ramping up even further in October. Speaking to my colleagues in Mumbai, they tell me that November has been considerably quieter, but you really get a sense of this slide, even just showing 2 years worth, how volatile the market has been, and also how depressed it was in 2020, showing that line, which is a 5-year average, just how weak imports were last year and how they appear to burst into life. That's obviously been helped by the easing of restrictions. I believe it was in August, so timed quite well for the onset last month of the wedding and festive season. And so, you know, trying to crystal ball gaze for next year, the feeling is the guys are quite optimistic in Mumbai. I think there is a sense of guarded optimism as well, because there are concerns as crowds have gathered, as families have gathered over the past month or so and continue to do so. You know, will we see, unfortunately, new lockdown restrictions being introduced? So that's something that the guys, I think, are quite mindful of in our Mumbai office. Even so, when we look at jewellery and silverware, looking first at silverware, much smaller market, as you can see, but you can also see very quickly how dominant India is in this space. Whereas for the top one for jewellery, yes, India is coming back quite nicely. It may get back to pre-pandemic levels by next year. But also you can see that it's yes, it's important, but nothing like we see in the silverware market. And we've certainly seen a strong rebound in Europe and the US as well. So when we bring that all together, what does it mean for the overall silver market? Well, I wanted to very quickly start with a slide for 2019 to 2020. And you can see red across a number of categories. And then if we transition into 2020 to 2021, you can see that we are getting back over, in terms of our estimate, of 1 billion ounces. So that is exceeding where we were pre-pandemic. And then if we think about next year, we are looking at over 1.1 billion ounces of global demand. And that will be a record high in our series, which goes back to 2010, and potentially a record high full stop. And then just to really bring it all together, what does it mean for the market overall? Although we haven't spoken about supply, I think it's quite dangerous for me to do so, we do think that the recovery in demand will exceed the upside that we see on the supply side. And therefore, we could see the market transition into a physical deficit. Just to put that into some sort of perspective, though, I mean, that I think is a positive for the market. But I would say that given that we're looking at deficits of around 20 or 30 million ounces this year, around the 40 million ounce market next year, we have to put that into the context of the market where global demand, as I've just shown you, is comfortably over 1 billion ounces. So just to put that into a bit of perspective. But I think on that, with that interesting dynamic, I'd like to hand back to Edel, and I'd happily take any questions if there are any.
Perfect. Thank you, Philip. That was really good. I have lots of questions, I warn you. I guess to begin where you started, so looking at industrial demand. So looking into 2022, where do you see the risks out there?
I think the risks are, well, I guess there's a number of risks. When you think about the chip shortage and the disruptions, there's a lot of uncertainty there. I think most commentators would expect the chip shortage to dissipate very heavily by sometime over end of H1 into early H2. And so, if that, is extended, that is a palpable risk. We've already seen, as I touched on earlier, to pick on one element or one area, from an auto, how those forecasts were really downgraded quite significantly and on an ongoing basis this year rather. And so it's whether that, that recovery next year is dampened as one example. And I think the other one from a price point of view, although it may not perhaps be so much for 22, maybe longer term, but if we do see prices spike and that volatility, that I think is another cause for concern as well.
Is that cause for enough concern that it could push the silver market back into a situation where it's a surplus that we're more used to?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think so much for, for next year that's possible, given that the deficit we're looking at, 40 to 50 million ounces is obviously a very small deficit, as the context. So it doesn't take much, does it really, to see that swing, perhaps more to neutrality than anything else. But again, if you combine a volatile price perhaps more than we're expecting, will be very good for physical investment. And so you could find that offset sort of playing out as well.
Yeah, I guess there is a lot of swing factors here at play, including India. And it was quite amazing to see that the India customs chart showing imports, those strong recovery for September and October. So not a question as such, more an observation from me. So in terms of, I guess one of the key takeaways that people will take from this presentation is that move from a silver market deficit to surplus to an expected market forecast for this year and next year. What does that mean for price?
I think ultimately, probably not a tremendous amount, because if you look at one of the earlier slides, for example, the surplus we had last year was pretty eye-watering. Yet, prices did very, very well. That was largely, I think, mopped up by in the ETF space or the OTC as well. I think it's interesting from a sentiment standpoint, but I think that investors will be more concerned what's happening in terms of inflation, for example, and the macro outlook. And I think those deficits, I think, are ultimately, I would suggest, too modest to have much of an impact on price.
Okay, yeah, so there's a question that came in linked to that. So is silver investment driven solely by inflation / macro factors, or do people think this is a great bet for new technology demand?
I think it's a combination. I think earlier this year, and I think I touched on it very briefly, there was, I think, a lot of interest in green technologies. And I think this was interesting, I think, one of Matthew's slide about how the platinum price performed in the early part of the year. And I know we got a lot of inquiries from one of our clients in terms of, how is silver being used, or what is the outlook for silver in the PV market? Whereas, it's I think a very established use already. But I think investors, certainly, I think a lot of spotlight on that. I think a lot of that has dissipated recently, even though silver is still performing exceptionally well and still doing very well from a PV point of view. But from a price point of view, I think investors now, I think the emphasis has certainly switched back to macro factors.
And do you think those macro factors are going to keep that large holding by ETP investors at bay, because it's increased massively from the start of the year? Are you confident that's not an overhang for the market as we look to 2022?
Well, I think we do tend to see retail investors in sort of Western retail investors, their holdings tend to be much stickier, be it in the ETF space or the coin and bar space. You need to look back to 2013 when you had that washout in gold ETFs, silver ETFs, barely, as I remember it, sort of battered an eyelid. So I think, yes, we would regard it as a very sticky investment rather than being an overhang, at least for now.
Another question that we received so about investment as well, and linking it to some of the crypto discussions from earlier. So the question is, the person said, I got the question about investment into crypto for gold a lot, but what do you think about the impact crypto has been on silver investment demand? Does it have an impact?
I think I would suggest the impact is much more in the gold space in a number of jurisdictions. And again, speaking to my colleagues that cover parts of East Asia, there's been, I think, amongst perhaps younger investors, I'm not sure my age, but younger investors, there's definitely been a lot more interest in the crypto space. Whereas I think in the US, yes, I think it's diverted funds away from gold. I think that's been fairly clear. I would say perhaps a little less so in the silver space, anecdotally at least.
Yeah, okay. You spoke about the Reddit squeeze earlier in the year. Do you think that could happen again?
You would never say never. I would say possibly unlikely, because there was a lot of talk then with the hashtag $100, and we did see a concerted inflow of money into the market, and as I mentioned in the presentation, still got up to $30. Whereas if it happened, let's say it happens next year, and then we don't have the shortages of products that we had then, because we don't have the logistical issues of trying to get product from A to B. So if there's a lot more product, then demand could be a lot stronger. That could push prices up. But I think other investors could potentially come in and see how relatively little impact it had on this year rather, and could be there on the other end, on the other side to maybe short into that as well. So I think possibly, but I'd be surprised if it could do much more from a price point of view.
Okay, and during that event earlier in the year, did you find that you got a lot of phone calls, say, from end users of silver, really concerned about the volatility in the market then? So back to, in a sense, the earlier part of your presentation, you were talking about some elements of thrifting. How much concern and panic were there in the physical end users, particularly on the industrial side at that time?
We didn't get a tremendous amount, but I think the people we've spoken to since then have taken a step back and looking at that. There is definitely concern when silver gets towards the $30 mark. So I think they were certainly watching that to see if that would have been sustained. And so I think if you had held around the $30 mark for a while, or for example, we had been in a range of, say, the high 20s to the low 30s, I think that would start to perhaps concentrate efforts to maybe, push the boat out on thrifting if they can. I think it's not that simple, because there are technical limitations. People use, or industrialists use, silver because of its fantastic properties that it offers. So I think they're always pushing it up against those boundaries. But I think, a price of around $30 will certainly concentrate their minds.
Okay, brilliant, Philip. Thank you. I'm just going to ask the other presenters to turn on their videos just before we sign off. Brilliant, thank you. Jim, I just had a question for you, as you are the Chief Precious Metals Analyst at HSBC. What are you thinking about gold right now as we look towards 2022, particularly with COVID concerns growing?
Well, I think that we're going to be sort of played off from a number of things. I think it's important to remember that there's going to be a background of withdrawal of monetary and fiscal stimulus, regardless of COVID. And let's hope it doesn't get any worse. At least let's hope it doesn't definitely get worse enough to promote or to prompt a big government intervention in that sense. So you really are looking at a background that is not so favorable to gold as last year. We're also moderately positive on the US dollar, and the combination of those things are going to keep a cap on gold. I think also, one has to be sensitive to emerging market demand, and as you get up to 1850, there's a clear. In fact, we're already still in territory that really historically dissuades emerging market demand, although we have a rush back from last year's weak levels, and so the upside looks to be capped for those reasons. And just when I was listening to Philip's excellent presentation on silver, it reminded me that there is a bit of a division between Wall Street and Main Street right now, both in silver and gold, and we see that in the lack of demand in the ETFs, so the modest liquidation, but the robust demand for both small bars and gold coins. So there is a dichotomy. One of them's wrong, at least in the longer term. Now, I think there's enough inflation concerns, and there's enough geopolitical risks, and there's enough latent jewelry demand to support the market at reasonable levels. Absolutely not looking for any major downturn. So not much beyond what we have now, the levels we have now moving into next year. We're rather moderate in our range.
Okay, and just I'm conscious of time. Just one last question for you, Jim. In terms of, say, client questions and also colleagues, how much interest is there for gold right now? Not just from that general gold community, but when you look broader at that broader macro community where gold just enters their radar as and when things get exciting. How much of that radar or spotlight is on gold now?
It's been reduced from last year. Last year was stellar. So again, that's a very similar question to the price. I mean, prices are already very high, and so to say we're not looking for them to be significantly above where we are now makes us look bearish, but we're not. Prices are actually pretty good, and the demand and the interest, client-wise and elsewhere, all across the bullion spectrum, was very, very high last year. It is reduced this year, but that's not to say that it's weak compared to, say, before the global financial crisis. I mean, when it was downright poor. Okay.
Matthew, do you have an outlook on PGMs for 2022 that you wish to share in 60 seconds?
Well, I was going to say I've been at Anglo for 2 years, and it's been in some ways quite easy for an analyst because we have these massive shocks to the market.
Did you say easy?
Well,
Jim might be applying for that role, so.
The biggest demand source for PGMs is the automotive market. Yeah, I mean, Philip's touched on this. We had this big recession in 2020, then we had this massive recovery. Then this year we're expecting a great year, and then we had this supply side shock of the chip shortage. We follow this very closely, and there's always bad and good news, but I'd say the balance of bad and good news has shifted towards good news in the last few weeks. And so some of these forecasts you get from LMC and IHS, these groups of a 12% increase, don't look in car production next year, don't look out of reach here. Obviously, in the last week, we've had more bad news about COVID and so on. But as far as we can see, the demand side for autos remains very strong. And so, we should see that increase in production, and we should see a pickup in PGM demand next year.
And does it look stronger for platinum over palladium, or vice versa?
So we are, I'd say, like most forecasters, expecting some substitution of platinum, of palladium for platinum. So in a sense, we do see a better year for platinum automotive demand than palladium.
Okay, wonderful. So we're at 3 o'clock UK time. Gents, I want to thank you very, very much for taking part today. There was wonderful involvement from you, and we really do appreciate you doing this virtually. Hopefully this time next year, we will be just finishing our in-person seminar and then getting ready for our annual dinner. But if you have any questions for any of the panelists or myself, please do get in touch with us here at LBMA. And without further ado, I will just say thank you and wish you all a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Edel.
Thanks, Edel.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Edel.
Bye.